Melissa Norris here. You're listening to the Dragging Alaska podcast, where David Bays and I sit down with candidates running for governor, Senate, and House to talk about one issue: trawl fishing in Alaska. It's one of the most talked about topics in this year's elections, and our goal is simple: help Alaskans understand where each candidate stands and what they plan to do about it. Just a reminder, if you appreciate this effort by David and I interviewing candidates on Trawl, be sure to comment on these episodes, review and share them. And please do tag Dragging Alaska whenever you share. Today, we're joined by Mary Peltola, who is running for U.S. Senate as part of Alaska's federal delegation. Mary is a former state legislator who represented Western Alaska in the Alaska House of Representatives for 10 years before being elected to Congress. She has built much of her public service around fisheries, rural communities, and resource development issues. If Alaska's fisheries matter to you, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Mary will tell us a little bit about herself and where she's from.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I am Mary Peltola. I grew up here in Alaska on the Kuskokwim River. When I was growing up, the fishery on the commercial fishery was really kind of in its infancy. It was in its beginning, I think. And so I started fishing in 1979 with my dad in a homemade little skiff. And one of my first memories fishing was our skiff. It had real low sideboards, and it was so full of chums. It must have been around the 4th of July. It must have been around the peak of the chum run, but it was a little bit choppy out there. And we just did too many drifts of these, these full fathom drifts where you get 200, 300 fish. You're worried your net's going to sink and you pull it in. So we were driving to Bethel and the freeboard was like this. And I was just worried as a little 6-year-old we were going to swamp because the boat was just so full of fish. It was just at capacity. And that's kind of one of my first memories of early fishing, being cold and wet and hungry, but also just boatloads of fish, literally boatloads of fish. And then fast forward to when I'm raising my kids, I just assumed my kids would grow up commercial fishing and tendering like I had grown up. That was always my assumption growing up. And then to be in a situation where we were no longer allowed to drift, even for subsistence fish, and working with the department was just really frustrating. And we were kind of, I feel like, being sold a bill of goods on the run strength and escapement targets. And, it was like they were trying to act like there was just this feeling in the fish meetings that I remember, in the late teens, early 20s, just feeling like they're acting like we weren't here, that we don't remember the bailers full of fish and the cranes and the shipping containers of chum roe and, the Asian processors who used to come over. It was really an industrial operation. And, to see it go from that scale on the Kuskokwim to practically nothing in my lifetime has really been one of the most shocking and concerning. And, it's just a real motivator. I think that fear and anger are a real motivator, and they really have been for me. And I've always been very interested in public policy. And of course, growing up fishing and coming from a culture where the word for food is the same word as the word for fish, 80% of our diet is fish. It just kind of felt like a culmination of my two worlds colliding. And that really was the impetus for running in 2022, is just to elevate these issues of scarcity. And it's not the Kuskokwim. It's not just the Kuskokwim. We're seeing this, it specifically for Chinook salmon in every river in the state without exception. And we do have robust commercial fisheries, and they should be trumpeted, and we should be doing what we can to help the commercial industry and the sport industry and the subsistence folks. And I don't want to diminish the good work that is happening on the commercial side with the species and the gear types that are making record profits and doing really well in our economy. But I just, when I talk about fish, it's from a very personal, visceral place, and what it means to the people where I'm from and what it means to the future of the people that I'm from. And that really includes all Alaskans at this point.
So you said that was the impetus for getting you started running on a national level.
So that really was the motivation to run in 2022, and it was just a series of events, ranked choice voting and being the 4th person to make the top 4, the pick one primary, and, I snuck in with 10,000 votes, and I was up against 3 millionaires, and we all know how that went, and then the 2 years in DC. Well, and I think it's also kinda noteworthy that here I was out in the hinterlands, out in the middle of nowhere, 75 miles off the Bering Sea, if you're going by way of river. I had a married name and no name recognition at that point. I had been out of state politics for 14 years, and really the tailwind and the current and the tide that shifted that whole campaign was the fish piece and Alaskans really connecting with the fact that the slogan of my campaign started with fish, fish, family, freedom. And, for those of us who care so much about this, for it to not have been talked about for so long. And one of the things I'm most proud of is this new culture in Alaska where if you're running for statewide office, if you're running for office, you have to be conversant on fish issues. You have to share what your values are on fish with people. And that wasn't always the case. I mean, for so many years, I just noticed so many folks in politics saying, oh, it's just too complicated. I don't understand. It's not too complicated. It is not too complicated at all. Even just in 4 years, see that progression within Alaskan politics has been something I'm really proud of. And then just the movement. There is such a movement, and to be part of this movement of leaders from around the state who have been working on this at a macro level and a micro level and are kind of new to it and have been through it for so long, it gives me a lot of hope to see the momentum and this movement that has really taken shape.
You describe your life or like career leading up to when Don Young had died in like that 2022 election. You were with KRITFC, right?
I'm impressed you latched onto the name. It stands for Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission, and at that, and I had worked for them for 5 years, and it's co a coalition of 33 villages along the Kuskokwim River who depend on our salmon runs, and that entity has partnered is in an MOU with the feds, the Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Fish and Wildlife division, department, wait, the bureaucratic name. So with Fish and Wildlife on the federal side, and under ANILCA and working with through the Federal Subsistence Board process, because the runs are so poor and such a concern, we were able for 5 years and actually 6 years to appeal to the Federal Subsistence Board to do what they call federalize the river so that it's under federal management and federal waters, which is the majority of the lower Kuskokwim. So this Intertribal Fish Commission had elected among themselves in-season managers. So I worked with the in-season managers and the refuge to try to get as much fishing as we possibly could for local fishermen while also being really committed to really impressive escapement goals and just trying to walk that fine line of harvesting as much as we possibly can while we're staying committed to our escapement goals. And the Kuskokwim River has the best escapement record statewide, and in large part, it's because of the work of the people who live along that river to make sure we're meeting that escapement target.
I think that was the first time that I'd run into your name. So we started doing that stop bycatch group in like early 2020, and Don Young was still alive. And I remember at one point you'd ask if you could call me, and I was like, "Who's this lady?" No offense. And
Hey,
but
no,
anyway,
there's a lot of people who had the same reaction.
but it had been like I was working on the boat. It was like night at night, and I think you started to tear up, on the other side of the phone talking about the issues up there. And to me and Homer, I am ashamed to say, was totally disconnected from like the Yukon crisis. I think you guys have been shut down for 2 years at that point, and so it's always been an interesting thing for me to come back to. Is I don't agree with a lot of politicians on a lot of different policies, but the one thing that I always say in regards to Mary Peltola is like, you can't say this, she's faking this. She was there long before Don Young died, before the position came open, and it was like a passionate. I mean, that changed my perspective and my trajectory was to hear it from your side. So
Well, that's meaningful. And I think that there are so many pockets of Alaskans that are connected on this. And just because of geography and logistics and the way that our management systems are kind of bifurcated and kind of chopped up even within the same management systems. It's easy for us not to know each other. Even the region that I'm from is the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region. I was really surprised as an adult to realize I don't know much, if anything, about how the Yukon is managed, how they do their fisheries. They have international treaties that they have to work toward getting escapement there. And they don't have the same kind of sonar and counting stations and weirs that the Cusco does. So, I mean, even in my own region on these two parallel rivers, there is such a disconnect.
Well, and that kind of speaks to like the size of Alaska too. Everybody loses track of we think you're a neighbor that's 1,000 miles away, which is like Canada to Mexico difference. Can
Yeah.
you talk us through some of the stuff you worked on when you were in Congress before?
Sure. One of the things that I'm really proud of is working with the two senators on making sure that we could unclog the logjam on disaster relief funds. I mean, we would just say disaster relief is a disaster because there was a clog up in OMB, Office of Management and Budget, where these funds would be cleared by Congress quickly, and then they would just be parked in OMB and not move for years and years and years. And that's just horrible for fishermen who are still having to make payments on all of their equipment and their overhead. So that was one of the things that I worked on. And it's really impactful to talk to the fishing families who've been waiting for that money for so many years and then seeing it come through. And then of course things like trying to incentivize the folks, the mom and pops on getting equipment to reduce bycatch, rollers, cameras, lights, things like that. Looking at definitions, I think that, in recent years, there has been a lot more light shed on pelagic fishing being, for so many years we had been told, oh, they're midwater trawl, they don't touch the bottom. And then to find out that 40 to 80% of the time they're on the bottom without all of those kind of improvements that have been made to the bottom trawlers, the rollers and then as it turns out, in some instances, they can be much more damaging. So let's get our arms around that. Let's figure out how to name these things in ways that aren't euphemism or deceitful about their true impact. There's a long list. There's a long list. And it's things that I think we should certainly still be working on. Looking at the composition of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council and getting more Alaskans on that council and having the council much more reflective of Alaskans, not just one industry, one sector, one species focused.
Is there something that you think is like low hanging fruit in regards to like reforming trawl through Washington, D.C., or did you run into these recurring themes? Not necessarily low hanging fruit, but something like approachable or an angle. We've talked about like that maybe NPFMC members should have to recuse themselves if their employer is, involved in the industry they're voting on, or like this definitions or common sense type thing. Did any of those really stick
Course,
out?
yeah, there's so much low-hanging fruit. There's so many things that just seem like they would be mom and apple pie and no-brainers and why isn't this already a thing? And I am here to tell you, low-hanging fruit in the Congress that we have now doesn't really exist. It's like no fruit. It's so intractable. There's so much deadlock. It's just such a do-nothing Congress. It's so partisan. My takeaway from my 2 years in Congress was everything I vote on is an attack ad, whether I vote yes or no. And this is no way to run a government. And I was in the minority, and there's no, when I was coming up in politics, it was very boring. And kind of the overarching culture was everybody saves face. Everybody here needs to be um, respected, really, and then the appearance of respect. And fast forward 14 years later, and social media has happened, and a lot of other things that have been really degrading to the fabric. I think a lot of the niche news things, and so this is a different environment where I didn't feel like there was any low hanging fruit, David. It was just a tough slog.
Mm.
And so that's why I want to zoom out, in terms of the campaign and look at what are some systemic changes that can be made. Let's do term limits. Let's make it so it's not as attractive financially to be a member of Congress. Half of our members are millionaires or billionaires. Half of our membership is lining their own pockets as we speak. They're allowed to do stock trades based on confidential classified information that they're privy to. The incumbent has quadrupled his own personal wealth in the last 12 years. I think this is an indictment. I don't think this is the way any government should be run, let alone ours. I think the dream of our system was that it be reflective of the electorate. We do not have that right now. And until we have management boards, like all the way from North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, that's reflective of the people that they're there to serve, to our city council, state legislature, our delegation. In my opinion, Alaska only has 3 members of the delegation that comprise 535 members of Congress, 435 on the House side, 100 on the Senate side. Those 3 members have to be just Herculean in the amount of things that they take on. And we have a delegation right now where it's 1 out of 3 pulling their weight. We are really underpowered. We have got to just do a much better job in terms of really representing at the micro level and the macro level in Congress. And that's a
I
really horrible answer, David, but this is just me being honest.
Yeah. You were talking about like the like partisan gridlock. I always thought one of the interesting things about your last campaign is you had a like the NRA sponsorship or something, hadn't you? No.
They gave me an A.
They give you an A. Did that like improve relations in DC, or did that make it weird within your own party, or it didn't matter?
I was the third least likely Democrat to vote with my own caucus. And the administration, I think they really just kind of they were not enamored of me at all when by the time things wrapped up there. I mean, it was a tough relationship. And I think there are a lot of folks in DC who didn't really know what to make of me. I was a member of the Western Caucus, which is like I think 106 Republicans.
Mhm.
And then, I the other funny thing is, like, on the Second Amendment issue, I think that I think there still kind of is this idea or this projection that that's a political stance that I'm taking for votes, and not that it's not my personal values. And, just like the Alex Preddy thing, I was like climbing the walls. My teeth were itching. Like, this is a very personal feeling that I have about Second Amendment rights and the freedom to have a weapon on yourself. I mean, I go to fish camp with a bear gun because I need to be loaded for bear. And I think any reasonable, sensible Alaskan understands the importance of firearms and firearm protection. So, yeah, I was endorsed by the NRA. I got an A. Yeah.
That's become like this interesting, like Alaska is so unique and everybody wants to box the world or the United States into just Republican or just Democrat. And you're like, but I deal with it every day on Trawl because I see it as
Yeah.
like the definition of bipartisan, and guns in Alaska are, I think, kind of the definition of bipartisan. So it's just some interesting parallels, but it's like you can't convince somebody that that could ever be true or that that's like how you grew up or like just part of life, but it is for us.
But in the bush parts of Alaska, to be a Democrat is very different. I mean, we're very spiritual, we're very religious, we're very traditional. So being a Democrat is just a different vibe. The other thing I think is noteworthy about Alaska and that I'm really proud of is that we're over 60% independent, partisan, undeclared. And you see this bipartisan spirit really evidently in our legislature. Our Senate is bipartisan, our House is tripartisan, and they have been such an amazing example of how to do it in a truly, like, really looking at Alaskan challenges and coming up with Alaskan solutions regardless of party.
I've had some like national level reporters ask me about like, is Trawl specifically like, is that Republican in Alaska or is that Democrat in Alaska? Like one of the things I keep coming back to is that like Alaskans just like don't like government in general, like nobody really wants to be boxed into one side or the other, or if there's some commonality theme, it's that like we don't like it in the first place, like over party, which I don't think a lot of the rest of the world sees. I think a lot of people pick sides and that's like slam the door and that's the end of the conversation, but very much not here, or at least withdrawal.
One of the things that was eye-opening to me in the lower 48 is to see how there these political parties are there their personal identities,
Mhm.
and they see themselves through the lens of these parties. And I just don't think the parties have the same kind of hold over people's imaginations here, or like I said, self-identity. I mean, fishermen, we describe ourselves first, I think, by our species and gear type. Like I'm a drift net fisherman from the Kuskokwim, salmon. Definitely the regions that we're from, the rivers that we're from. I think there is a tendency, at least for me, to the river that I'm from, where I grew up fishing, that's the only place that exists to me in my mind every summer. These other places, they're just like mythical places. Probably won't even go to these places. Like we're just so focused on our spots. I don't know if you feel that way, but I know a lot of folks like, the people that I grew up around, and even the people who I have met through these fish meetings, the places where we fish, these places where we hunt and fish, they're like a whole nother character in our lives. They're like people. There's such a strong relationship with these places. And I don't think that that's just a native thing. I really see it with my non-native friends who grew up fishing and hunting too. There's just such a emotional tie to the place you're from. And that's the worldview I think that or the self-identity that we have over things like a political party.
Yeah, that's been interesting for me in Homer with guiding is that we have, I'll take out 1,000 tourists in a year or whatever, and they say, "Hey, I'm going to Juneau. What should I do?" Or Seward, "What should I do?" Or Soldotna, 60 miles away, and they say, "What should I do?" Or "What restaurant?" And I have to say it. I've never been outside of Homer in the summer in my life, since I was
Yeah.
9 years old. This is all I know, which is a weird realization for anyone. Now I think about like, what's the rest of the world like in the summertime? I've seen in the winter, but never in the summer and probably never will. So
So one of my
it's weird.
best friends got married in the summer, and it was during Silvers, and I was a teenager and I was in her wedding. And so of course I had to go to Anchorage to her wedding to be in her wedding. And my dad just had a cow because who leaves when there's a fish opening? There's a
Mhm.
period that day. Like this is the peak of the silver run. And I came to Anchorage and I was blown away by how beautiful it is because it was all the flowers, and I mean, it is majestic here. It's majestic in the winter, but I'd only kind of seen it snowy and, October, to springtime. So exactly, like, until I was almost like 20 years old, I hadn't even been to Anchorage in the summer.
Yeah, I flew to Juneau in June one time to look at a boat, and I was like, "Wow, this is like a whole nother
Yeah.
part of Alaska I've never been to." There were cruise ships and helicopters in the air, and I didn't know that part of Alaska existed, in that way.
Well, and that's how I feel about a lot of things in Alaska. I'm so proud to be from here, and I've had amazing opportunities to see so many different places in Alaska and experience so many different amazing things that most Alaskans don't have a chance to do. But I've been lucky through my work to be able to travel a lot. And that's one of the things that I am really cognizant of. And when I served on the fisheries committee, it was a special committee in the legislature. I don't think it's ever been a standing committee, but every year it's a special committee. And
Did you have a lot of involvement with the NPFMC, like, through KRTFC? Were you in that process and, like, in the trenches of it?
only there towards the end, I really dragged my feet on participating at that level because having been part of the legislative process where it's relatively easy to roll up your sleeves and get involved, just dive in and be effective and make changes to some degree. You can see cumulative like micro changes over time. I just didn't have that impression of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. Even doing things at the AP level just seemed so futile, like from
Mhm.
a stakeholder perspective. And it's really intimidating as well, because if you don't have a science background, if you say something like extinction, it is lightning fast before you are made to feel a fool, because all of the Western scientists, everybody who has a scientific background says, well, there's no such thing as extinction. It's extirpate. That's the word. It's extirpate. Well, what's the difference? Well, not much, but there's a right and a wrong word. So I was often very nervous to participate because of not knowing these little, very important academic things. I feel like when you don't know the academic terminology and aren't steeped in the process, it's just so easy to write someone off and say
Mhm.
they aren't grasping the concept of what we're doing here. And so anyway, there was a lot of trepidation and aversion to doing it, and a concern that you're just set up to fail.
Mhm.
How do you make change? And it's really hard to get next to the council members. You need to have, and if you have a family, if you're a hands-on parent, you can't be
Mhm.
going to these meetings for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So I was a bit fortunate because by the time I got involved, COVID had been happening and there were processes to dial in remotely. And so I didn't have to travel to these expensive places and spend the time. They call it a public process, but how public can it be when it's inaccessible by the real public?
Mhm.
And to be part of the process, you really have to be sponsored by a really lucrative company. No, I hadn't really been involved very long, and I really tried to make sure that the comments that I shared were speaking from my heart, and I wasn't trying to sound very scientific or Western sciency because, that was not I was not going to be effective, if I was looking at it from that angle. But I'll tell you this, I would also really talk to myself before the process started to say, okay, do not get emotionally attached to an outcome because the likelihood of an outcome being positive is 0 to infinitesimally small. And then you go through the process and the deliberations and you're talking to the council members and they look really invested and you're like, okay, I'm really reaching them. And maybe you're able to give a compelling argument and then the votes come down and not a single thing has changed. And there I am on it for an hour, laid out flat on my back on the couch, bawling my eyes out. It's a taxing experience to go through and also to try to fit in all of this just deep, heavy concern in 3 minutes or in 6 minutes, and then to be kind of politely told your time is up and then they just move on. And I mean, the people who have done it know how soul crushing it is.
Yes, it is soul crushing there and the board of fish.
And the board of fish, it's tough.
It's the same feeling. And all of these hopeful moments, something's gonna get past and then smack, nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I also went through a time where I was beating up on myself for having emotional feelings in these meetings with
Mhm.
scientists where we're not supposed to be emotional. And then read some book on negotiating. It said humans are emotional. Every single thing we do is emotional. Even if it doesn't elicit an emotional reaction, it's still emotional on some level. So cut yourself some slack. And so then I was just like, okay, I just need to acknowledge my emotions and try to work through them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And one of the really interesting and frustrating things with the NPFMC seems like more and more lately is that you'll see this super impassioned testimony from hundreds of people that live there and have lived there 10,000 years, against a couple dozen on the other side. But then the vote comes down unanimous. And that's the one that just, I think, twists the knife in everybody is like, what do you mean nobody agrees even a little bit? Or else you hear that the aftermath of it is somebody says, "Well, I couldn't vote against them because then they want to throw me out of the process, or they'd vote against my charter industry or my crab industry or whatever." And that's just, I mean, because there's so much baiting of like, if you just come and participate more, if you'd only participate more, they blame it on you for not coming to all the meetings essentially. And then it's like, well, you did come to the meeting this time, but we still voted unanimously against you, on this what seems like a pretty simple ethical issue. So that's been
Well,
tough.
and not only that, but I was shocked to hear people overtly saying, well, these subsistence fishermen, they flare up, but they go away.
Mm-hmm.
That's tough to hear. I think
Yeah.
that it's enough of a really, I mean, when I hear a flare up, I don't think of a group of human beings, but I think that that kind of characterization has really motivated. Well, I mean, there's no. So I recently went out to 6 villages. 2 of them were on the Lower Yukon, 4 were on the Bering Sea coast, and I went to St. Mary's and Pilot Station. And the level of sorrow and the level of anger is completely justified to have, in Pilot Station, they told me they haven't been able to fish for 7 years. And that to me is just inhumane. And there is a feeling in these communities overtly stated that there is a feeling that being starved out.
Mm, mhm,
So I think that that is a what more compelling of a reason could there possibly be to participate in these meetings, every single meeting without exception, than the reality that we're living in some of our remote villages where they're also, this is compounded by $9 a gallon for stove oil and gas. Scammon Bay is paying $10 a gallon for stove oil and gas. There is a very strong belief that when the first barge lands, the price will probably be about $14 a gallon for gas and stove oil. How do you feed your family when that is your heating bill? Or how do you have enough gas to go hunting or berry picking or whatever hunting and gathering you're doing? It takes gas. Like we were talking about, these distances are really far. And of course, we're all going to smaller, more efficient modes, but they still require travel. A box of ammo in Hooper Bay is $50, $60. This is just not sustainable. And then to be told we can't harvest the wild foods that have sustained us for so long, and then we're seeing all this wanton waste and the real damaging effects of the methods of fishing.
mhm. Yeah, I think that, maybe it's a Alaskan thing or a fisherman thing, but we also have this, I think that has played into the NPFMC meetings and, like, participation over multiple years is that I really see it like in interior Alaska that, like, essentially, I'm not gonna argue with a fool, or, like, if you don't feel like you're having an equal or, like, a argument where you're on the same basis or that, like, the ethical part is being overrun by money, that we all have this kinda, like, just, "You're dead to me," like, "You're wrong, I know that you're wrong, and, like, I know that I can never convince you, so I'm not gonna engage in this for perpetuity," which is unfortunately doesn't match up well at all with the NPFMC process because we're saying this stuff take like 8 years and there might be, 5,000 Alaskans that engage on the same topic over 8 years, but the NPFMC doesn't collect all of those comments into one. They say, well, that happened in June, like turn the switch, that comment's dead. If that guy doesn't show up again in October, like it's like it never happened, which is really tough for people here to deal with, especially. And the economic factor of, 5 meetings of 2 weeks each is 10 weeks, that's 2.5 months of who can do that? Nobody unless you're paid, unless your job's sponsoring it essentially.
Yeah. And that kind of time away from your family, and everybody I know is really dialed into their family and hands on with their family. Who can afford to be miss that many ball games or
Mhm,
all the things. The management systems that Alaskans are working within do not match up with the way that we conduct business. We are really open door. We're really face to face. We typically don't need a whole host of words and definitions and explanations. We're pretty plain spoken. We're pretty not very wordy. We get the gist. There's just a level of simpatico, I feel like, among most Alaskans where it's not like a surgical, and like you say, these management systems that are surgical and can basically delete things like you're talking about, like pretend it didn't happen. I mean, it's kind of like when I'm arguing with a teenager. One of my boys, when he was 13, he was arguing with me like an attorney. And I said, "You know what I'm saying right now, right?" And we just burst out laughing because he knew exactly what he was doing. And there's times one of my mom's first cousins, he was one of our commissioners on our fish commission. He was the fish commissioner for Bethel, and he just had such a joyful spirit and just such a great sense of humor. And the department would come out with some outlandish, like absolutely silly thing that they're trying to sell us on. And discounting people's comments and acting like they're not valid. And like you say, I mean, there is some kind of form of gaslighting going on.
Yeah, you see it all over the Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch group page, people commenting, trawler specific, folks who even live in Alaska. Some of them make such crazy comments and then just write LOL in every single one of them. And the fact that it makes me feel like, they want to protect their own livelihood and they don't care about the rest of the Alaskans. It affects when you give us that kind of flippant attitude back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Had you had, like, direct face-to-face headwinds when you were in DC from trawl or, like, out-of-state trawl groups, or were they, like, in your office all the time, or did they not like you from the start, or a mix?
Well, I just think at that level, there's such a high level of sophistication that there is a desire to play nice and I think not poke the hornet's nest.
Mm,
Um, so everyone I interacted with was very cordial, and I work hard to make sure that my interactions are cordial. You know, they say for every one bad interaction you have with someone, whether it's a coworker or your child or your spouse, it takes 5 good interactions to make up for that one bad interaction. So
Mm.
regardless of who it is, I try to keep my interactions really positive. You know, there are Alaskans who would come to the office. There are communities where they are very reliant on the those tax revenues and their municipal governments. That is the economic engine for them. And so there, you know, there were some hard feelings, but it was always really polite and respectful. But that would definitely come through. You know, I was picking up what they were laying down.
yeah. Oh, I guess I just mean like in general for any person of the Alaska delegation, do you feel like there's a lot of like troll influence or troll pressure in DC?
I do. I mean, there's that fish fry that they have over, you know, I mean,
Hmm.
and there's a presence, you know, they're around. And I mean, these are sophisticated operators. You know, they're operating in 3D chess, and that's not the system that I grew up in. I mean, I'm just very like what you see is what you get. And that is not the level of mastery that a lot of these folks are operating at.
Sure. I think people lose perspective of like the cumulative wages that go into kind of like the troll message, or like if you add up all the like lobbyists or industry analysts or advocacy groups, I mean, a lot of those are like 180,000 to $250,000 a year jobs created solely to like keep them fishing, or keep regulations low. And so that's always interesting to me in Alaska, especially with this governor race, is like we're just plain Alaskans, they really care type deal. But if you start to like look into wages and history and stuff, it's this $1 million message being steered in. And I imagine the exact same in DC.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, again, the level of sophistication should not ever be underestimated.
What we talked about like salmon as food in the Kuskokwim and Yukon, but can you walk? I don't know if everybody's familiar with like just how far it goes into like the buildup of society and theology and like transportation. We've talked about like sled dog teams having to be put down at commerce. That's the main moneymaker or had been. What did you grown up with?
Well, like I said, our word naka means it's a generic word for food, and naka is also the generic word for fish. If you look in the Yupik dictionary, there aren't that many words for snow. Like people say, you know, Inupiaks have this many words, hundreds of words for snow. We have a lot of words for ice, but the one of the areas where I saw the most word roots was under the word fish. Like second wife literally translate to woman who prepares fish.
Hmm.
Pretty romantic, I know. And like you said, David, we all, where I'm from, it's a real dog mushing mecca. We're real dog mushing people, and they were an integral part of every one of our families for getting up to spring camp in the spring and harvesting parka squirrels and just every hunt that you did, everywhere you went, it was with a dog team. And and Yupiks used to put up thousands of fish a summer, hundreds and thousands of fish each camp, because the rule of thumb is for one dog, they need one fish a day to live. So you're drawing fish for your dog every day, 365. So even a dog team of 10, that's a lot of fish that you're
Hmm.
putting up. And that's just for your dog team. And then the town of Bethel, the real name of Bethel is Mamtrisarmut. It means the place of many fish caches, like stockpiles of fish. There's some portions of our river. It's the lower part of the river, and there's some pinch points that make it really easy and productive to catch fish there. The river that my mom is from, right upriver, it's biggest of the lower tributaries. It's the biggest, and the Queethlook River, Guichluk, it means bad river or muddy river. But this river, the village that my mom's from, is like almost 900 people, and it's always been a big village because this river is a massive producer of salmon, and historically it produced millions of chums every summer. And those numbers have really drastically gone down. I mentioned, in Queethlook, 80% of the diet is fish. Half of that is salmon, half of it is resident fish like pike and whitefish and burbot, blackfish. But 80% of your diet is a very huge portion. And one of the first stories that children learn as a little kid is the Blackfish song, where there's a little blackfish swimming up the river, and he sees a blackfish trap and he thinks, don't know if I want to give myself to this trap. Let me see how the person who owns this trap lives their life. So he pops his head up and he sees that the dogs are not staked out in a very logical, organized way. The guy is like ladling out fish right in front of them. There's fish bones everywhere. It's a very disheveled, not respectful camp. So he says, "No, I'm not going to be fish bones on at that guy's camp." I mean, I'm embellishing a lot here. So then he goes down and sees another fish trap and says, "Okay, let's see what this fish trap owner looks like." And the dogs are neatly staked. Everybody's super respectful. Everybody's living by the rules and as they should. And this blackfish says, "Yes, this is who I want to give myself to." And we also really believe that, the fish, they can hear you, and if you're being disrespectful, they will not give themselves to you. Like when we started catching single digit numbers of fish in our set net, my first thought was literally to myself, like, what have I been doing disrespectfully that is causing these fish not to come to my net? I mean, I think it just goes to show how deeply embedded this relationship is between what you harvest and how you live your life. My first thought wasn't what's going on, with anyone else. It's like, what am I doing wrong personally?
Mm.
What are my kids? What is my family doing that's breaking our rules? And then there was and this is a weird thing to admit, but when I started hearing that we were like highliners, our single digit of fish was like 8, and then other camps were getting like 3 or 5, I was so relieved that it wasn't me
Mm.
breaking rules or doing something that was objectionable. So we are and then when managers say over harvest, and even if the managers mean that in terms of collectively as a river we're over harvesting or as a community we're over harvesting, there's such a personal attack there. Like, to say that I'm over harvesting or wasting is there's almost nothing you could say worse to someone other than maybe you're greedy or you're stingy. But, if you're wasteful, that is just,
Mm.
a high crime, and it has real repercussions. So then you look at a system where it's legal to discard metric tons of juvenile halibut, salmon, and crab when we have been instructed how to use every single morsel of that fish. I mean, every portion. We don't eat the fins, we don't eat the guts, we don't eat the gills. Almost everything else is consumed. We eat the meat off the backbones, we dry backbones. Just the way, we eat fish heads, we eat fish cheeks. My father-in-law taught me how he likes to have his heads cut. You remove the teeth, you remove the gills, and there's certain cuts that you do. And this is just commonplace. Everybody knows these, how you eat all parts of the fish and how long it can sustain you.
There's been, I think early on in this, maybe early 2020s, the Dunleavy had done a couple like executive orders that said, "Hey, we acknowledge that the returning fish runs are low in the Yukon Kuskokwim, and so we're going to extend the moose season longer so that people that normally had salmon could hunt for moose instead," which I'm in support of because everybody needs to eat. But at the same time, there's this
Protein is
bigger
protein.
concern,
Yeah.
yeah, of like, have you seen impact? I've heard about like bears coming into villages at odd times, like they're hungry or like they've woken up from hibernation and then they have to be put down because you can't have a hungry brown bear next to your kids, and concerns about like moose and caribou populations. Have you seen that unfold in real time or heard about it anecdotally?
I think everything's suffering. Salmon is a cornerstone species. Ecosystems rely on salmon for certain types of flora, for certain songbirds. Charlie Wright is a guy from the Yukon River, and we were part of a group called the Salmon Fellows. They had 2 cohorts, and Charlie, we were talking about traditional knowledge and what things you can see in nature that correspond with the salmon run. And Charlie's observation where he's from is, if there are yellow butterflies, that means there are king salmon in the river. And if there are big, masses of yellow butterflies, that means that they're there in abundance.
Hmm.
So yellow butterflies are
Yeah.
impacted by salmon runs. And I think, all those fish fry impact different everything, the
Mhm.
decomposition, that biomass. Our headwaters used to stink. They don't stink anymore. And
Mhm.
we liked that smell. But you go to any of our headwaters and they do not stink. There is just not the biomass that our ecosystem has been accustomed to.
What have you seen like impacts on kids or like, like I guess we're raising a generation now that this is the norm tragically, which is across the state. We've talked about how now we're raising kids that have never caught a fish in the river, but hearing trawl ads on the radio is just like a normal part of everyday life. That's unthinkable to us, but it's becoming reality. But I assume on the YK that that's times 1,000 or like
Well, we're
inspiration to stay in villages where you were raised, or was that the like commercial engine that kept things going?
it was a commercial engine for a long time, and I was a beneficiary of that commercial engine for sure. I mean, we fished kings. That was the first species that we would target, and then the reds and chums would come in together, and then the silvers in August. That was absolutely an economic engine, and it was just really, I th for my generation, it taught us a work ethic. I mean, it really shaped us. D there is I was I've noticed things. I mean, yeah, also at my generation, when a young lady was, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, you were proficient in um, knowing how to put up a fish, cut a fish, in a way to preserve it. My younger sister is really an amazing fish cutter, and she could do 40 or 50 kings a day. And it just takes so much skill. Well, her daughter isn't going to have that kind of proficiency. We just don't have the volume. It's amazing if you have 50 kings a season to put
Mhm.
away, let alone in one day. On the Kuskokwim, we've been able to fish at least 20% of our need. And so my kids have grown up with fishing. I mean, there have been certain summers where I would joke that they were the MVP. I mean, one summer, one of my boys had to camp out with two of his friends at our set net site because we had so much poaching going on. And just the
Mm.
fact that those three, 11, 12-year-old boys were camping there overnight meant that we had fish at all. Another summer, my 11-year-old and 13-year-olds were the experts, that their eyesight is much better than mine and my father-in-law's, so they were there scraping off the maggots, so we had edible fish. Every year it's like I like to, do a MVP, and that's a horrible thing to do. I do not recommend this, but it really goes to show that it's an enterprise and every single person is a critical member of this overall enterprise. If you're 11 or 75, we all have something to contribute and we're all going to benefit from that fish. There's such a feeling of like cooperation and unity, and these life lessons you cannot teach in any other way. I can't teach my kids how to be Yupik unless we're hunting or fishing. When my one of my kids was in 5th grade, I asked, we were out drifting, and we were done with our fish, and I said, "Well, who are you going to give your catch to?" He's 10 years old, and he immediately said the name of a family friend who had just become a widow.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking, okay, this is a Yupik kid. He knows exactly who his catch is going to, and it's somebody who really needs this catch. That's really impactful. I don't know what I would do if I was from a river where we can't fish at all.
Mhm.
There are just lessons that and they can be taught other ways. I mean, moose hunting is a wonderful way to teach your kids subsistence. You have to give away all of your first catch. So when a young person shoots their first moose, every bit of that is given away, and that value of sharing is really an integral part of harvesting anything. But there's, and my concern is the young people who don't even have a taste for fish because it's such a hot commodity, and we're all really sensitive about our elders needing to have the fish to sustain them, and making sure that teething babies are teething on dry fish. This is how we've always teethed our babies, and making sure that there's at least enough dry fish for a teething baby or somebody who's going through cancer. Like, this is really dismal. And here we are, we're just fighting for crumbs. We're fighting for
Mhm.
crumbs here. Um, and feeling starved out, and it is a cultural and a spiritual issue. It's also just a basic nutritional issue. And I hear people who get frustrated with these discussions say, well, nobody's starving out there. I beg to differ. If you are feeding your kids cup of noodles and top ramen and not salmon, that is another form of starvation. That is not nutritional content. You are not, it is just different. If you're eating processed food that's processed in a lab, designed specifically to make you more hungry, that's not nutrition. That's not what any of us consider good parenting. And then, SNAP benefits are being reduced. Social Security benefits are being reduced. The gas is going up. Stove oil is going up. Everything is going up. People aren't able to fish. And we're literally just fighting for crumbs.
Yeah, that's one of the most heartbreaking things to me is to see people that have interacted with like the NPFMC on allocation and regulations, and they'll come back to me and say, we lost. They voted unanimously against us, and they'll say, but at least they gave us a chance to talk, or at least it felt like they listened. And it's like, Jesus, this is the whole culture being, just decimated, and statewide. And it's been so bad for so long that now we have people that go, and if somebody will give them 5 minutes, it's like, thank you, great savior, but it wasn't how it was meant to be, or I don't think any of us think that's how it was meant to be.
No, definitely not. And the one of the places where I am very self-conscious is I do not want to overpromise. I don't want to make any promises because this is a do nothing Congress. It's a long shot that I'm going to win this race to begin with. I'm very focused on November 3rd and not making promises about November 4th, but this is my life's work. Whether it's this campaign or a Senate term or whatever is next, there is nothing more important to me than the health and well-being of our ecosystem and the health and well-being of Alaskans.
Do you think that it's like from your time in DC and like who you saw and who you met and the mechanics of the system, that there's a way for Alaskans to ever like effectively convey lifestyle or needs to the rest? Or did you find things that really resonated with, like, that get a blank stare until you said one sentence and then it started to click in people's minds, or is it just like too obscure?
I think it's very different, and it's really hard to communicate to lower 48 people about Alaska. So much of it you just can't believe until you see it yourself. You can't imagine. It's just so far out of most people's imaginations. And, just kind of an idea of how much work we have to do. I still have people laughing at the motto Fish Family Freedom. They think it's a punchline. This is not a punchline. There is nothing more serious. Or it has, if you're in fish management and working in a community where people are hungry and fearful and angry, there's concern your house is going to be burnt down. Like, this is not a funny, ampy, cute issue. There is nothing more serious and nothing more emotional. I went to Fort Yukon for the first time in 24, and a 9-year-old boy named Ben gave me a note, and I was just so overwhelmed with emotion. There was it said for Mary, and I opened it up, and this boy had a picture of a fish, and it was a really good picture of a salmon, and he said, "I believe in you to help save our salmon." This is a 9-year-old.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then it's like, how do I even get the composure to have a cogent response right now? There's nothing funny about this. Still, somehow, for people, and it's journalists, it's
Mhm.
kind of just a broad cross section of the lower 48 demographic who think it's funny.
Mhm.
And like everybody watching this podcast, their teeth are itching too, I'm sure, at the thought of anybody thinking there's anything humorous about this. I'm a
Mhm.
silly person. I believe in joy. I believe in humor. And like I like to say in Alaska, we do not ever joke about money, sex, politics, or hunting and fishing
Yeah.
and our guns.
Yeah, that's been interesting for me to see on this, like, we could call it a trawl pushback of like awareness and op-eds and radio ads and all this stuff where they'll try and like put it on one party or another or say that you should care about what Seattle needs or on and on. And it's just, they think that that's a winning strategy, and maybe it is, but like the more Alaskans that find out about this, the more who are, I think, wake up and are instantly against it. Like nobody wakes up and says, "I've been against bottom trawling all my life, but today from today on, I'm for this." I think it's suddenly become a great idea because I heard a radio ad. It only goes the opposite way because you can type into Google like impacts of bottom trawl, and it's this worldwide thing, you know. So that to me really points out this disconnect of like outside interests that think like, hey, we're gonna trick Alaskans into thinking that we're a good deal, or they don't deserve the fish, or they don't need the fish, or that they don't have to make it back to the gravel to spawn. But holy shit, like that's that's a terrible strategy, you know.
Well, and I think you're right. I think there is a broad underestimation of Alaskans.
Mhm,
Alaskans, we do not settle for status quo. Alaskans have a long storied history of creating things whole cloth to find solutions.
mhm,
And I'm floored by what, what you're describing, and I do agree with you that there is, like, this notion, like, through an ad campaign or something, that they're gonna win people over, and Alaskans are smart, Alaskans are brilliant, Alaskans are deep thinking, and we are so connected to this resource, and our livelihood and our family and our futures are all connected to this resource. There's nothing more important, and I don't think it's that easy to bamboozle us.
mhm.
Alaskans are sophisticated too. Even those of us who aren't super wealthy, we're sophisticated too.
Where did you I've heard about, like, Don Young was working on, like, redoing Magnuson-Stevens Act, and I think he had talked about, like, a couple Native representatives on the NPFMC as, like, additional seats. I'd seen that video of you there testifying when he was still alive. Can you walk us through, like, essentially what track he was on, or what, like, from personal conversations, if it felt like he was on board with what we're doing or not, or it's just like we lost that piece of history when he died, you know, or what Don Young's plan was or where he was going.
Yeah, he was the ranking member of the Resources Committee, and Jared Huffman was the chairman of the committee. And they were there. There were two different versions of a Magnuson's Rioth going through. And just to even testify, Jared Huffman had to find an Alaskan who Don Young would agree is a good Alaskan person to testify. And so luckily, I passed that gauntlet, and then when we met before that hearing, and he said, "Oh, of course I support having tribal seats. Of course. There's no question." There were some other things within Huffman's Rioth that he didn't agree with, but he was 100% on board with the tribal seats, and I like to remind people that Don Young was for that, and this is a not a niche issue by one demographic. The congressman for all Alaska, who had been the congressman for all Alaska for 49 years, was fully in support of this, and I think that says a lot. And he had been actually, this is so funny, he was the initiator of Magnuson-Stevens Act when it was the Young Studs bill. Gary Studs from
Hmm,
Massachusetts and Don Young had the original version, and when it went to the Senate, it became Magnuson-Stevens on the Senate side.
hmm.
I think it's hysterical it was called the Young Studs bill.
What a miss that was.
Yeah, but, he was well-versed in Magnuson-Stevens. He had been there since its origin. He was part of its origin story, and he was for the tribal seats. So I think that says a lot. And of course, Senator Murkowski is also for the tribal seats.
So there's was that new bycatch reduction. I can't remember the name of it, but Begich, Sullivan, and Murkowski had all signed off on one. Which
Bycatch reduction. Oh, sorry. Fact.
have you looked through that much? Is there stuff that you like or don't like about it, or it didn't make much of
Yeah,
a splash?
yeah. My understanding is that it does a lot of things that are not deeply impactful.
It seems to be founded on the concept of doing more research.
See, I cry foul. I don't need another study. I know that our system is hurting, and it's been 60 years in the making. Hopefully, it doesn't take us 60 years to rebound. I think we all need to start pulling in the same direction here now. And then maybe in 30 years, we will hopefully have the kind of abundance that we have now if we're all pulling in the same direction. But I'm just thankful that this is a movement now, and there is a will, there's a political will to see change. And there are people in Alaska who will not accept the status quo and are calling out this as corruption, legal corruption, and not representative of the people. Like, I mean, even this is not a rural issue. This is an all of Alaska issue. If you look at the people who depend on the Copper River, who depend on the Kenai River, for years, urban Alaskans or people who live along the road system could depend on at least 6 freezer fish a year. That was the average harvest for all of the road system. 6 freezer fish a year. That's a lot of fish. But because those have no economic value in terms of a tax value to the state and to the managers, it is not a priority. There's lip service given to the primary priorities being consumptive, subsistence, personal use, sport fishing, and then commercial fishing. That is not at all the way it's prioritized when the rubber meets the road. It's prioritized in terms of ex vessel value, in terms of the cash value of a commodity. And when they're just freezer fish or fish on our drying racks, that somehow is prioritized in a much much distant second, third, fourth, fifth priority to the cash value resources.
Yeah.
We didn't get by on just 6 a year.
I
We
couldn't
did
either.
well. When we had a dog team, we had a chest freezer with freezer fish, and we'd put one of those in the pressure cooker every day. Lifelong friend of mine said, every time I smell pressure cooked fish, I think of you guys because your porch always smelled like pressure cooked fish because we were feeding our dogs that every day.
Everyone wants to know, Mary, like, what are you going to do when we elect a senator? Like, what's your first plan then? What are you attacking first with this issue?
Well, Melissa, I mean, like I said earlier, it is not a foregone conclusion that I'm going to walk into this seat. It is going to be a really, really tough campaign. I mean, we're 207 days out, and I don't think we've even really seen any attack ads yet. So this is going to be a tough slog until November 3rd. And I am very disciplined about not making promises, but I think that it's safe to say this will always be my life's work. I'm very committed to making sure that my kids and grandkids stay in Alaska and have the same kind of abundance that we grew up with. And if you look at my 20 plus years of public service, I have always been a middle of the road person. I've always been listening first before talking, and I intend to keep doing that and finding ways to help these management meetings move the dial, because you've both been in enough of these meetings to know that we can be mealy-mouthed all day long and not say anything and not do anything and have lots of excuses and, oh, we need more research, this data set isn't big enough, or, oh, we didn't do one survey, or we don't have a quorum, or endless things. And good public policy, you figure out dials and things levers that can be maneuvered to get there. And that's what I want to do. I want to figure out all the levers and dials that we can, whether it's by council in terms of legislation, working with administration. I really want to get our research funding up to where it was when Ted Stevens was fighting for us. The way that Washington State, Maria Cantwell, has been able to subvert so many of the research dollars to Washington State, and the middle managers, the career people at these federal agencies saying, well, the intent language says it has to be for extinct species or treaty tribes. Baloney. That is not true. Ted Stevens never would have gone along with intent language that would have precluded Alaska from being a contender. We need survey dollars. We need research dollars. I am very much for data sets, but I don't think we should be waiting 1 second longer to make management decisions based on some data that's just going to show the numbers get worse. How much proof do we possibly need? So I don't know if that answered your question, Melissa, but I am going to be working on this in every way, shape, and form I possibly can till my dying breath.
You and David and me, all of us.
Oh, I'm looking for a way out.
Hundreds, thousands of Alaskans.
Good luck, buddy.
Thousands of Alaskans.
You guys are on your own.
No, that's just not.
We're gonna need you.
I'm telling you, this is a clinical condition. There is no way you can swear this work off. It is in us. This is just the fabric of who we are now.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things for me is that I watch, like I think everybody is introduced to this, or I am from Homer, which is different than the YK, but by like the raw bycatch numbers of like, they threw away 5 million pounds of halibut this year, and our limit's 2 million pounds, and we're being cut back 30%, but this waste isn't. Like, how can that possibly be ethical? But, you can only work on those numbers for so long and repeat them so many times, and it's tragic every time you have to say it, but at the same time, it's kind of like, you're losing interest, but the big driver for me has been like essentially to watch this NPFMC meeting where people testifying are essentially being made fun of, or like that somebody says they're subsistent on the Yukon, and you hear this vibe back from NPFMC members or Trawl reps of like, that doesn't matter. We're making millions off of that. And then it becomes like this integral Alaskan like hunting and fishing ethical issue, I think. So that's been, and I think that's driven all of us, is like, it would be one thing if people said, yeah, we're the biggest players in the room. We realize that we could have these massive impacts. Like, let's do it together. But That's not the initial vibe back. The initial vibe back is like making fun of you losers because you don't make as much money off of it. But that just is heart wrenching, for an Alaskan anybody.
Well, and I think as humans, we have to find ways to justify what we do in order to be able to live with ourselves. And yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I see that directly in
If you
all of
can't
the
say anything nice,
rebuttals. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also think that Alaskans, we have felt what it's like to make transformative changes in our own communities within, I feel like in a state with 750,000 people, and if we were a country, we'd be the 18th largest country in the world. We all know that feeling of agency. We have to have agency. We have to be, individual responsibility, agency, action driven. And to see something as immovable as this organization, and it's human made, we know that this thing, if there's political will, we can do anything. I just feel like Alaskans are getting to the point where we're just calling bullshit and saying this is unacceptable. And I feel like we're at the point where we are demanding that our elected officials not
mm,
deflect and demur and get mealy mouthed and act like they can't, piece together the pieces. It's not that complex. This is not rocket science. This is resource management. So I just feel like Alaskans aren't going to stand by and watch nothing happen forever.
yeah, I've had worries. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but like I have this moments where I think of like, I wonder if I'm going to be the one that like ends up telling Alaskans to be nicer to Trawl, to like, hey, like let's let it settle out
What?
through the legal channels, and like it has to be incremental type thing. I feel like I do that already. Is that like there's this big ban of like or big vibe of like we're gonna ban Troll tomorrow, and I get that gets hung around my neck through the Facebook page because that's a popular thing. But the reality is, I think like let's put new people. The governor puts new people on the NPFMC. They bring forward these motions that mean something, and then it gets hammered out through research, and either it goes or it doesn't go. The Secretary of Commerce still has to sign off on it. But Troll also fearmongers this of like, you're going to put us out of business tomorrow. But I don't think that's the reasonable way through. And I think that people know that and understand it. And it just makes the Troll claim of we're going out of business tomorrow even more laughable, because I think what really pushes people is that they want these common sense motions to at least make it to the floor, get voted on by people that aren't trawlers themselves, and then the wheels of government turn. And if Trawl can still fish into those new regs, then it's a new conversation. But we have to at least be allowed to put forward those new regs, which I don't think we are.
But my concern is that, as we've pointed out here already multiple times, like it's such an emotional reaction to our fish and our land and our areas. We're so attached to it all that it is evoking this whole we want it banned concept in Alaska, right? There's research done that shows 80% of Alaskans want to see it banned. Well, I'm concerned that that's going to impact these elections really hard, in that if you're not holding your conviction that you're gonna do everything you can to see to that ban versus mitigate some of the issues that are affecting all of us, which is way more of a reasonable approach. I'm afraid that the right people may not get elected based on that extreme point of view. And look, I want to see a ban too. I'm not going to lie. Do I think that when you say, "Oh, well, we're going to ban it we're going to ban it tomorrow"? No, I think that's almost impossible, right? We've got so many big walls up that's financially driven and backed that it's like at every point that we turn, all of these different interviews, I'm hoping that someone can do something, and then I'm so dejected that they can't. So,
Well, and I think a lot of this is a civics discussion because we have a system where one person, and we're seeing this tested by this administration, but our system is designed to be slow and cumbersome and be a consensus driven model and involve hundreds and thousands of people to make these decisions. It is not a system where one person can ever, I mean, it's a fantasy to think one person could come in and make swooping, dramatic, fast changes. That is just fantastical. And yeah, we all wish that could happen, but wishes are for children. And this system, most public policy things take at least 10 years. When I was in my 20s and first in state politics, I was like, 10 years, that's forever. And you look at it, we've been in this conversation longer than 10 years now, but these things just take so long because I see you doing your math there, David. I saw your wheels turning. How long have you been doing it?
I'd looked up something from 2011 that I'd posted. 15 years then.
15 years. Okay. Touche. Even better. But, these things take a long time. It shouldn't be 15 years to see no substantive movement. But I think to go and think for people to think that we could get to a total ban like that is fantastical as well. I think that everything takes time as it was designed to do. But that is not to say we're going to sit around and wait forever. That's not
Mm,
practical. That's not practicable. Um, I'm glad you guys got that joke.
Yeah,
at S9. Well, yeah, and I think I agree with that, but I think the flip side to that is that it is practicable to put forward like motions or bills tomorrow or on day one that even if you know that they fail, I mean, there's this concept of like a messaging bill that says, hey, world, we need to know about this. We know we don't have whatever, if you're in the House side of it, 250 votes or whatever, but we do need it to get it on the floor, at least start these wheels turning. And that's the big atrocity or whatever to me is that we've gone on so long knowing about so much of it, but we've been procedurally blocked from even talking about it, and or our reps in DC haven't brought it forward, in a meaningful way, even if they know it's going to fail the first round. But that how else can a conversation begin if it doesn't come up initially?
Well, and it's supposed to be a living document type of idea. Like we're supposed to be responsive to the public. It's supposed to be a representative system, at all these different levels. And it's not representing all of us. It's over representing one group.
Mm,
And that's why it's broken. And that's what we're all fighting against. Ran under the motto Fish Family Freedom because I wanted to elevate this issue. I said this is the best kept secret in Alaska. This is the best kept secret in the United States. Let's talk about this. I did not ever pretend that I was going to single handedly come in and rescue some operation. I don't imagine that I have that kind of fantastical powers. I said, I want to work on this with everybody. And then what I saw happen was when there wasn't instant change, even as the most freshman member of a minority, there was this, real quick shift to blaming me and saying that I'm part of this problem. There's only so much one person can do out of 435 in a system that's designed to go as slow as molasses, at a glacial pace. And that's not to say that we don't need activists pushing from the inside. If you're on the inside, pushing from the outside, but if you're on the inside, there's just so much birth, leverage, whatever one person can do. And that's and I still got a lot done. I still got a lot done. I'm not going to diminish the gains that we did make. I was 1 out of 535 on some of these things. I was the one member of the 3 out of our delegation on some of these things. The 3 of us were pulling together. I just think, imagining one person or group can make really substantive broad-based changes quickly, that's just not within the realm of possibilities. But collectively, yeah, we can do anything. Collectively, this movement can do anything. And it starts with getting representatives who really represent us and not millionaires and billionaires.
Mm.
yeah. Well, and I think that's been my realization, or that was I kind of had like this Boston Tea Party moment with the NPFMC of like, it doesn't matter what we go in there and say or what we do or who's ethically right or who's ethically wrong. Like, we're not going to have trawl vested people take quota or bycatch out of their pockets and give it to us because we need it. From a fiscal perspective, they'll say they can't. They'll say it's impossible, which then creates this realization. It's like if instead of the Revolutionary War, we just kept going to England and saying, please be, couldn't you, couldn't you be nicer to us? Couldn't you be nicer to us? You can only do that for so long, but we have to like create a new system or go over their head through politicians or public awareness or like the judges, essentially.
And David, this is one symptom of this humongous systemic problem. You look at homelessness, there is not a concerted effort, there is not a champion. And so many of the federal programs are being cut, shifted to the municipalities, state programs cut, shifted to the municipalities. Municipalities can't solve homelessness alone, but the millionaires and billionaires do not care about homelessness. We saw massive spikes in our health insurance. Where are our advocates there? All of these efforts to have mergers of giant grocery companies. I was on the front end of saying, no, this is not tenable. Like in Alaska, we need at least two competitors, but there are so few people who are not working for the agenda of the millionaires and billionaires who want to focus on everyday households, everyday people. And this is one of myriad symptoms of this larger, really. And I think more of us are seeing the direct link to this disconnect between Congress and households.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with somebody, and they were asking why they think trawl had become such a big conversation. And I think a big part of it is that it's this metaphor for all the things you were talking about. These bigger, like people are frustrated with government, especially Alaskans are frustrated with Washington, D.C. government. But those are huge issues. Like we can have an opinion on Iran, but we can't really dig in nuts and bolts to it and understand every second of it, or whatever it may be. But trawl is just big enough and just small enough that, and we've interacted with so many parts of it personally, that it's really easy for Alaskans to grasp. And I think a lot of their frustration and anger from worldwide politics, DC politics, gets now fed into this trawl issue because they say maybe I shouldn't have an opinion on XYZ and DC, but I can absolutely have an opinion on trawl, and I'm going to make the most out of it. I think that's pushed people or pushes people in the back.
I completely agree. And I think another reason there's so much focus on trawl is because we have these existential threats like global climate change and ocean temperatures rising by 1 or 2 degrees. We have no way to get our arms around that living in Alaska. Acidification. How do we get our arms around that? Even marine debris. How do we get our arms around this? Like these are such massive things. How do we prevent salmon sharks from going more to the north? That is something that there is no management council for those things for us to go and try to work with. But there is a management council for trawling, and
Mhm.
that is a human activity that can be controlled by humans. I'm not saying that all of it makes sense, but we're emotional creatures and we have to have an outlet for these existential and literal, very in our face problems. I mean, we're living hand to mouth. We have to put this somewhere and try to fix something, some piece of this.
Yeah, you're totally right. I think that's been a big driver for like across all these races, essentially.
Well, and I am not one to say I know everything about fishing, but again, this is my life's work and I could talk about fishing all day long. And if the campaign could be only about fishing, that would be just fine by me.
Yeah. So hey, we got a couple questions we always kind of wind down with. One of them is if you had this realization that the laws or regulations you were advocating for in DC eventually wound up ending the trawl fishery as we know it in Alaska, if you would be okay with that. And then the other one is if you are accepting money from trawl or if you turned it down in the past, or if you'd be okay making a statement saying that if you got it and somebody called you out that you'd give it back, or where you sit on those two.
So, the first question, I am more than happy to refuse any funding or money or contribution or donation from the trawling industry. I do not want that money. Fundraising's hard, but not that hard. And I am comfortable with it, with the concept of trawling ending, with banning the trawl as a gear type. And if for CDQ groups, I think there should be a real effort and success at making them whole and finding ways to support their communities without that, if that's eventually banned.
I think history also shows us that essentially every trawl that's happened at this level has essentially crashed itself. There's this fear mongering rhetorical question of what if we shut down trawl? But the flip side of that is what if trawl shuts down trawl and then their factory vessels move on and we're stuck cleaning up the mess?
Well, that wraps up this episode of Dragging Alaska. We created this podcast as a public service effort to help keep our fisheries and resource conversations front and center. If you found value in today's episode, please follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with others who care about Alaska's future. Your comments, feedback, and support help us continue these conversations and reach many more people across the state. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Dragging Alaska.